Somewhere in a federal evidence file in New York, there is a recording of a chief executive talking about Enron. That is not unusual by itself. Enron comes up often in American business, usually as a warning. What makes this recording different is who is speaking. It is not a short seller, not a whistleblower, not a prosecutor. It is, according to federal prosecutors, the founder of the company himself, comparing his own business to the most infamous accounting fraud in American history on a call he did not know would end up in the hands of the FBI. The company was Tricolor Holdings, a used car dealer and subprime lender from Dallas, Texas. In September 2025, it collapsed, almost overnight, and prosecutors now allege that behind its fall was a fraud of nearly $1 billion, built, loan by loan, out of cars that had been promised to more than one bank at the same time. What separates Tricolor from most corporate collapses is that this company wore a halo. It was not a shadowy offshore operation. It was certified by the United States Treasury as a community development financial institution. It was praised as a model of financial inclusion. It was financed by some of the largest banks on Wall Street and drew investment from BlackRock. The story investors were told was one of technology and social good. The story prosecutors tell is very different. And the distance between those two stories is what this case is really about. Daniel Chu founded Tricolor in 2007 in Dallas. The business idea was simple and, in its way, genuinely clever. Millions of people in Texas and across the American Southwest, many of them Hispanic immigrants, a large share of them undocumented, lived almost entirely outside the formal financial system. No social security number, no credit score, no access to a normal car loan. And in most of Texas, no car means no job. Tricolor sold used cars to exactly these customers and financed the purchases itself, using individual taxpayer identification numbers instead of social security numbers and its own underwriting instead of credit bureaus. The company grew into a network of dealerships across Texas and the Southwest, selling tens of thousands of vehicles. It said it had built a proprietary, artificial intelligence-driven underwriting model that could measure the creditworthiness of people the credit bureaus could not see, using thousands of data points instead of a score. It was a story tailor-made for its era: technology plus inclusion, profit plus purpose. In 2022, business magazines profiled the company admiringly. Here, it seemed, was proof that serving the overlooked could be both righteous and lucrative. To appreciate what Tricolor claimed to be, you have to understand the industry it claimed to be better than. The bottom rung of American car finance is the world of buy here, pay here lots. Dealers who finance their own sales at punishing interest rates, install GPS trackers and remote starter interrupt devices, and repossess quickly and often. For customers with no credit file, it has long been the only option, and consumer advocates have spent decades documenting its abuses. Tricolor positioned itself as the humane, data-driven alternative, rates it described as well below the corner lot, a path toward building formal credit, dignity in the showroom. Whether that promise was fully kept is now the subject of its own reporting and litigation. But as a narrative, it was commercial gold. It placed moral distance between Tricolor and its own industry, and moral distance, it turned out, could be monetized. In 2019, the United States Treasury certified Tricolor as a community development financial institution, a designation reserved for lenders that serve underserved communities. Chu promoted the certification proudly, and it mattered. It reassured socially minded investors. It burnished every pitch. The company later disclosed that 69% of its 2023 customers were undocumented, a fact it presented not as a risk, but as a mission. Tricolor was lending to the people banks would not touch, and Wall Street, in a low-interest world hungry for yield, was happy to finance it. The financing worked like this. Banks extended what are called warehouse lines of credit, large revolving loans secured by pools of Tricolor's auto loans, with each car loan serving as a small piece of collateral. Separately, Tricolor bundled loans into securitizations, selling roughly $2.7 billion of asset-backed bonds to investors over the years. JPMorgan, Barclays, and Fifth Third were among its warehouse lenders, alongside regional players like Origin Bancorp and Triumph Financial. Some of its bond deals were even designated as social bonds, marketed to investors who wanted measurable community impact alongside their yield, and rating agencies blessed the senior slices as investment grade. Every part of the machine depended on one assumption, that the loans pledged as collateral existed, belonged to Tricolor, and had been pledged to only one lender at a time. According to federal prosecutors, that assumption failed as far back as 2018. The indictment describes a scheme in which the same auto loan was pledged as collateral to more than one bank simultaneously, and in which loans that had already been sold into securitizations and therefore no longer belonged to the company at all were pledged again as if they did. Prosecutors also allege that data files provided to lenders were doctored, making ineligible or worthless loans appear to be sound collateral. By the end, according to the charges, Tricolor had pledged roughly $2.2 billion in collateral against assets of only about $1.4 billion. Roughly $800 million of what the banks thought stood behind their loans, prosecutors say, simply was not there. If the allegations are true, why did no one catch it for 7 years? Part of the answer is structural. Each bank saw only its own lending relationship, its own collateral reports, its own data files. The loan pools contained tens of thousands of vehicles, identified in long electronic lists. Verification relied on sampling, on audits, and above all, on trust. The entire architecture of asset-backed lending rests on the assumption that no borrower would dare pledge the same car twice, because discovery would be catastrophic. Prosecutors allege the irregularities reached even into audited financial statements. The system was built to catch mistakes. It was not built to catch, in the government's words, systematic fraud. And part of the answer may be the halo itself. Tricolor was not just another subprime lender, it was a certified force for good, a company whose mission made skepticism feel almost distasteful. Who wants to be the analyst accusing the immigrant lending, Treasury certified inclusion champion of fraud? The company's virtue was, in effect, part of its collateral. According to prosecutors, it was under this cover that executives, at Chu's direction, kept the machine fed. With the alleged double pledging accelerating as the subprime auto market tightened, used car economics soured, and cash grew scarce. The timing, in hindsight, tells its own story. The pandemic years had sent used car prices to historic highs, then dropped them hard. Inflation squeezed exactly the working-class borrowers Tricolor served. And by 2023 and 2024, subprime auto delinquencies across the industry were running at some of the highest levels in decades. A lender whose real economics were deteriorating would have felt the vice close in precisely those years. And it is precisely through those years, prosecutors allege, that the misrepresentations continued, all the way to September 2025. When honest growth slows, a company can shrink, or it can pretend. The government's case is that Tricolor pretended, on an industrial scale. The alleged scheme was not a one-man operation, according to the charging documents. Around Chu stood a small group of senior executives: Chief Financial Officer Jerome Collar, Chief Operating Officer David Goodgame, and Finance Executive Amron Seibold are all named in connection with the alleged conspiracy. That detail matters, not only for what it says about the company's culture, but because of what those individuals would later do when federal agents came asking questions. The end began, reportedly, with a phone call. In the summer of 2025, JPMorgan contacted the company with questions about its collateral data. The lenders, until then siloed, began comparing notes and discovered, according to subsequent reporting and court filings, the same vehicles appearing as collateral on more than one bank's books. Once that happened, the unraveling was extraordinarily fast. Within weeks, the company that had been a Wall Street darling could not fund itself at all. On September 10, 2025, Tricolor filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. Not a reorganization, but a straight liquidation. There was no attempt to save the business. The dealerships went dark, and thousands of employees lost their jobs, effectively overnight. The choice of Chapter 7, liquidation, rather than the Chapter 11 reorganization most large companies attempt, was itself a message. Those closest to the books had concluded there was nothing left worth saving. Within days, reports surfaced that the Justice Department had opened an investigation. The damage radiated outward. JPMorgan disclosed a loss of about $170 million tied to Tricolor. Fifth Third and Barclays each absorbed charge-offs well above $100 million. In total, according to the indictment, 9 banks and lenders were caught in what prosecutors describe as a $923 million fraud enterprise. In October 2025, on an earnings call, JPMorgan's chief executive Jamie Dimon reflecting on Tricolor and on First Brands, an auto parts conglomerate that had imploded the same season under its own opaque financing, offered a warning that immediately entered the vocabulary of Wall Street. When you see one cockroach, there are probably more. Coming from the head of America's largest bank, it was less an observation than a verdict on an era of loose lending. But the quietest damage landed on the people Tricolor said it existed to serve: tens of thousands of borrowers, many of them undocumented families who had stretched to buy a car, were left in limbo. Vehicle titles were trapped in bankruptcy proceedings. Some customers who had fully paid off their cars reportedly could not obtain clean titles. The company that had marketed itself as the fair alternative for the overlooked left many of those same customers with high-interest loans, uncertain paperwork, and no one to call. Then came the prosecutors. On December 16, 2025, Jerome Collar, the former chief financial officer, quietly pleaded guilty to fraud charges in Manhattan federal court and agreed to cooperate with the government. The next day, the Justice Department unsealed an indictment against Daniel Chu and David Goodgame, accusing them of orchestrating what it called a systematic fraud on Tricolor's lenders. Both men initially pleaded not guilty. It was in these court filings that the recordings surfaced. According to prosecutors, the FBI obtained audio of Chu comparing Tricolor's situation to Enron. On a recorded call described by the government, Chu and others allegedly discussed a remarkable strategy: that they could blame the banks for ignoring red flags and use that threat as leverage to extract a favorable settlement. If the government's description is accurate, it is a rare thing in white-collar cases. Not an outside accusation, but the founder's own framing, in his own voice, reaching for Enron as the nearest comparison to what was happening inside his company. In June 2026, the case escalated sharply. On June 24th, David Goodgame, the former chief operating officer, pleaded guilty to 6 fraud counts and agreed to cooperate, meaning both of Chu's most senior lieutenants are now witnesses for the prosecution. That same week, the government unsealed an expanded 8-count superseding indictment against Chu: bank fraud, securities fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy, and one charge that made white-collar lawyers across the country sit up. Prosecutors invoked the continuing financial crimes enterprise statute, known as the financial kingpin law. Enacted after the savings and loan crisis, it has been used only a handful of times in history. It applies when at least 4 people work together in a continuing financial scheme, generating at least $5 million in a 2-year window. And it carries a mandatory minimum sentence of 10 years, up to life in prison. It is, in effect, the government treating an alleged corporate fraud the way it treats a drug cartel. Chu pleaded not guilty to all charges on June 30, 2026. His defense argues that the kingpin charge is a novel, ill-defined legal theory stretched beyond what the facts support, and he maintains his innocence across the board. His trial is scheduled for October 2026. Until a jury speaks, the allegations remain allegations, though they are now supported by 2 guilty pleas from the executives who sat closest to the numbers. When that trial comes, it will likely turn on a familiar question in white-collar law: not whether the collateral was misrepresented. The guilty pleas and the bankruptcy make that hard to contest. But who directed it, and who knew? The government will put Chu's own former chief financial officer and chief operating officer on the stand, backed by documents, data files, and the recordings. The defense will argue that the kingpin statute was never meant for a case like this, and that the man at the top was not the architect the government describes. 12 jurors in Manhattan will have to decide which story the evidence supports. The aftershocks are still moving through the financial system. Warehouse lenders across the country have begun re-examining how collateral is verified, asking whether the same blind spots exist in their own books. Note holders sued the big banks over the securitizations, and the litigation over who should have caught what and when will likely run for years. In the world of private credit, the fast-growing, lightly regulated market that funded companies like Tricolor, the name has become shorthand for a question nobody can fully answer. How many more of these are out there? The case has also raised uncomfortable questions for the institutions that vouched for Tricolor along the way. How does a lender carry a Treasury Community Development certification into an alleged $900 million collateral fraud? What exactly did the auditors examine, and what did the rating agencies rate? None of those institutions has been accused of wrongdoing, but each of them lent Tricolor a piece of its credibility and each is now explaining, to regulators or to plaintiffs, what it knew and when. There is a bitter symmetry at the center of this story. Tricolor's pitch was that the credit system ignored real creditworthy people because it could not verify them. Its collapse, prosecutors allege, came from the mirror image of that failure. A financial system that extended billions because it believed it had verified collateral that was not real. Daniel Chu is entitled to his presumption of innocence, and a Manhattan jury will decide his fate. But whatever that verdict, the recording will remain, a founder, in the government's telling, measuring his own company against Enron. Perhaps the lesson is that a halo is a form of collateral too. And like any collateral, it is worth exactly as much as what stands behind it. If this case changes how you think about mission-driven finance, or about the banks that funded it, share your perspective in the comments. And if you want to follow the trial and the cases still to come, consider subscribing. The next investigation is already underway.